Hello, everyone, and welcome to this live stream about Riverpod and the state management for Flutter. And yeah, today I have here a special guest with me, Remi. So he is known for being the creator of Provider and also now Riverpod, at least for the state management. It's great to have you here, Remi. I think you're muted somehow.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, like I said, I'm happy to be here.
Okay. All right. In this live stream, we want to look at some questions from Riverpod that you have. So you can basically ask your questions, what you have about Riverpod. We will also look a bit through the documentation, how Riverpod works. And I think a lot of you know also Provider as a state management, and Riverpod is basically I think the extension we can say, or the next generation of Provider. And we want to look more closer at why to use Riverpod instead of Provider, for example, and we look at some benefits of Riverpod. Okay, maybe we start with the first question, or no, we don't start with the first question. First of all, we have a YouTube community, a WhatsApp community, and you can join it. So you can go to our YouTube channel, and then here you can go to the About section. And here you can join basically our WhatsApp community, and there you can talk with other people about Flutter related topics. So you can just click here and then you can join our WhatsApp community. So that's about the advertisement, and now we can directly jump into. So the main question probably for you, Remi, is what is the difference between Provider or Riverpod, and what should we now use? Should we use more Riverpod or Provider? Maybe you can tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, for this, first of all, I would say now, thanks to contributor on the documentation of Riverpod, there is a few pages explaining how Riverpod differentiate from Provider and how you can maybe migrate from Provider to Riverpod if you wanted to. So feel free to look at it.
Yes.
It's awesome. It's quite
Basically,
recent.
you're talking about this page here, I guess, right? Riverpod versus Provider.
Yes, there are actually a set of 3 pages, like one with motivation, quick start, and Provider versus Riverpod. But yes, pretty much.
Yes.
But yeah, overall, I would recommend considering using Riverpod if you can. I understand why some people want to stick with Provider. That's fine if you maybe have an existing project and you don't want to spend too much time migrating, or maybe you're used to it and you don't see a reason why you would switch. That's all right. But generally speaking, there are a few flaws with Provider, I would say, a few limitations. Like it provides basics for exposing an object to your with a tree and listening to that object, but it doesn't. It's not able to solve more complex problems like maybe auto refresh, handling typical network requests, like with catching errors, loading states, and maybe you want to combine 2 different states into a third state, or maybe whenever a state change, you want to update another state, stuff like those. Maybe you want to listen to a state to show a model or a snack bar when some value changes. Many of those typical minor issues, but that are when you add them all add them up, it starts to make a lot of small inconveniences with Provider. And Riverpod kind of is another attempt at solving the problem. It uses a relatively similar pattern in a way. It was originally designed as a major version of Provider. It's just I figured I would make a separate package just to avoid breaking people, just for the sake of it. But technically speaking, originally it was a major version of Provider. And so it adds missing features, So you can now do pull to refresh, infinite scrolling lists, stuff like those much more easily. So yeah, that's pretty much the point.
Yes, yes. Okay, I see. So, I mean, like, I know a lot of people that use still provider and they are like not yet, like, they are to maybe change it or they have not known so much about Riverpod yet. So that's maybe a good live stream to be then here now inside, so we talk more about it. Yeah, maybe we can start with like a quick demo, or like you can go through the documentation and can show us like what kind of things Riverpod offers and where maybe to start if you have never used before Riverpod.
Yeah,
Yes.
sure.
Okay. I think you can share your screen, right?
Yeah, it's already shared for me.
Yes, yes. Right now we see it.
Yes. Yeah, so it's a good start. It's a good time to start picking up Riverpod if you want to, because since this month, effectively, we have the new documentation available. So all the things we see here are new pages. We'll still have access to the old pages here, like they're flagged as old here, but technically everything you see here is new content. And so yeah, you can see again why you would want to use Riverpod. Maybe a quick start with maybe a dart pad, or using Zap on how to make a to-do list with a Riverpod. So you could go through it. So for a quick demo, I would suggest going through maybe the 2 or maybe 3 first few pages of the essentials category. They cover basic usage on what you would generally need in a typical application. Basically, what you should know is that Riverpod is trying to focus around network requests, because generally speaking, that's what you'll need to do the most in your typical applications. Riverpod is not tied to network requests, so you can do something other than network requests with it. It's just documentation center around it, because you'll do that 90% of the time, effectively. So here in this page here, we basically want to make simple applications which just read only. We make a bunch of GET requests to maybe obtain maybe a set of data from somewhere, maybe an open API like weather API, or here I believe in this example I use the board API, which generates random activity suggestions to people. So when you want to use Riverpod, the first thing you have to do is you have to set up what we call a provider scope. Basically, when you call run app in your main, the very first widget you have to insert is provider scope. It basically enables Riverpod in your entire application. And you should put it inside run app, and you should not put this widget inside my app, so that tests are able to maybe over change the behavior, but that's more advanced. So yeah, now that we set up provider scope, Riverpod should be installed in our application. And so we can start maybe defining network request. For this here in this section, we explain that we'll define a network request, maybe, and render it in our UI. So the first step is to make a model representing what we want to show in our application. Here, since I'm using the board API, which is this one, you can click on it. I don't think if I open it, I don't think you'll see it because I'm just sharing my window. But basically, this board API, when you call the get endpoint, it will return a JSON object with a random suggestion of an activity you could do if you're bored, like maybe go buy some lunch or something like that. And so we could define a class which represents a typical suggested activity. So we have a few properties in here, like the activity, the potential category, like maybe if it's maybe going to the restaurant, or if you want to learn something, that's a different category. The number of people required for this activity, like if you want to play a board game, you have multiple people. The potential price necessary, uh, even if it's zero, and around an ID unique to this activity. Of course, at every point, you can toggle the code generation toggle in the documentation, which basically transform all the snippets to use code generations instead, because Riverpod is kind of recommending code generation nowadays, so you'll see it used in a bunch of places. But yeah, again, you can use it without. Right, so we've defined the model. Then the next step is to define what we call a provider. A provider is a cached function which you will then be able to access inside widgets to obtain the result and listen to that result if it somehow changes. And so those cached functions are defined kind of like in an unusual way. Basically, you define a global variable and you wrap your function inside an object called provider. So here's a legend of all the possible options here. I won't go through them all individually, but a typical example would be if you want to do a network request, you want to use a feature provider. And so you define a variable representing whatever kind of object you want to expose. So maybe an activity provider, which is a type feature provider because network requests are asynchronous. So we want to use a feature provider. And then in here, we can do our GET request. We use the board API. We point to the endpoint necessary. Then we decode the JSON object. And we transform the JSON into our previously defined class here. This is your typical from JSON object. Again, if you use code generation, the syntax is relatively similar. When you do so, it's much more obvious that when we define a provider, we are actually just defining a function, because here we just see a normal Dart function with just an annotation. So now that we've defined a provider, the next step is to listen to that provider inside the UI. So we can create a typical widget. And in here, we can insert the consumer widget, which is a builder, which gives us a ref object. And that ref object is able to listen to providers. So we can do ref.watch.provider, the provider we defined before, so activity provider. And this syntax should be familiar to you if you've used provider before. It's like effectively the same thing as context.watch, but instead of passing a generic type, you pass the variable you defined before. And then you obtain here an async value of activity because the request is asynchronous. And so we obtain information about whether the request is loading or maybe in error state. And so you can react in the UI on this state. It's effectively the same thing as async snapshot from Stream Builder. And so the last step from here is to maybe use pattern matching from Dart 3 to switch over the different possible states. Like maybe, do we have data? If so, we show the data. Otherwise, if there is an error, we show an error message. Otherwise, we're in loading state, and therefore we show a spinner. So yeah, that should be typical simple GET request. So far, I'm not sure if it's worth it to go further right now. Do you think we should continue or maybe wait for some questions?
We can also like have in between some questions first of all from the community and see what they ask. So you can all put your questions inside if you have any
Mhm.
questions about Riverpod, or like maybe
Mm.
something to provider we can also look at. There's one question. Wait, yeah, maybe this we can like look at for now, and then we go back to the demo. So here's one question from one person. Is it easy to adopt from to Riverpod after learning provider, or is it like difficult?
Um, I guess it depends on how far you want to go. You should be able to pick it up fairly quickly to maybe if you want to use chance notifier provider or state notifier provider, whatever you were using in provider before. They are also available in Riverpod, so you could effectively use the same way of writing an application with Riverpod without actually changing the way you build applications, but just changing package. But then, as you use it more, you'll realize that the new features of Riverpod enable significant simplifications of logics, of your business logic. And therefore, you might want to start trying new things, maybe refactor different previous code, or use different approaches to simplify the logic. But at the same time, since it's using a different pattern, um, obviously there is a new learning curve here because it's not something you used in the regular provider package. So it kind of depends on you can get started quickly, and then over time you can learn more.
Yes, yes. Okay, all right. I think, yeah, we can go on with the second document. Maybe you said there are like three basic essential documents, right? Or do you want to say more about this first document here?
No, this one is fine. I've covered how to do a network request.
Mm-hmm.
The second one is how to once we've done a get request, we generally want to do updates. Because like maybe if you obtain the list of to-dos from your application, from your server, you want to maybe add or remove a to-do or maybe complete it. Because like if we reuse the syntax we saw previously, whether we used code generation or not, um, we define a provider and then we do the request, whatever that is, an HTTP GET, and then we decode it and return a bunch of to-dos. Here it's just simplified. But here with this syntax right now, we don't have a way to add to-dos. And so if you want to enable your UI to modify this state, you have to use a class instead of just a function. So the syntax is slightly different. Here, for example, when using code generation, instead of annotating a function, we annotate a class, which we generally call notifiers. And so basically, when you use a class, whatever is seen here in your function, you would move it inside a method named build. So you would copy paste this in here. And then if you just add nothing besides just the build method, the class with just a build method would be strictly equivalent to just having the function. You can view the function as syntax trigger for just having a single build method. But once you have a class, you can add different methods in here, and those methods would be available for widgets to invoke when you want to update your state. So again, I won't necessarily read every single line of code here, but an example would be first, if we want to migrate the previous function here to the class, we have this. And then we can start adding methods on here, like maybe an add to do method. And this add to do would maybe do a post request. to submit a to-do, you encode it into JSON and whatever. And then your UI is now able to invoke this method using the previous ref object that we saw. Using ref.read, we pass the to-do provider, which is the one we saw here, like to-do list provider. We have it here. Where are we? To-do list provider. And then we pass .notif here because we want to obtain the class instance so that we can call the add-to-do method. And so when we call .notif here, we obtain the instance of this object. So we can just directly invoke this. And so when we do this, this will perform our post request. But the thing is, in this post request here, we haven't yet updated the state. We just made a post request, but our UI doesn't currently reflect the change. And so to reflect changes, there are three main ways to do it generally, because it depends on your backend pretty much. Because say it depends on if you're maybe using like WebSockets, or maybe if you're using I forgot the word. It's a typical schema for backends where when you do a post request, the post request returns the new state of the application after that post request. So like, for example, the first approach in this documentation showcase how to, in the scenario where the server returns the new state, and so we can see here we obtain the response from the post request, and we decode the body, and then we save the body into the state by calling state equal whatever. Then our UI will automatically show the new state. But again, you can look at the other approaches. If maybe your backend doesn't return the new state, you can use maybe invalidate self. Basically, what this does is after your post request has completed, you can call invalidate self, and it will re-execute the get request. So you will refresh the current state, or maybe you can update the state by hand, like calling state equal and retain the list yourself. There are a few options. I would suggest going through the documentation because it explains the pros and cons of each approaches. Like maybe you want to be more efficient in terms of resources. Maybe you don't want to do an extra network request, or maybe you want to get the most up-to-date state. So it's interesting to see the different possibilities. And then if you look at the at this documentation, it also explains a more interactive example on how to do maybe showing the progress of the current operation. Like you see here, when we press the add to do button, it shows a spinner and maybe an error if there's an error. Yeah, I guess that's it for this page.
Okay. Yeah, I think we used like here different things like ref and read and ref and watch. Can you maybe like explain what is the difference when to use ref read, when to use ref watch? Because I saw in many codes they do it wrong and use it in the wrong place. So I think this might be like a good thing. Maybe we go back to your screen and you can even tell with the code when to use watch.
Basically, it depends on where you are when you try to read a provider. Like if you're inside a widget if you're inside the logic that renders UI, like maybe while the build method is executing, and maybe you're trying to build some taxes or maybe containers, whatever. Then in this case, you want to use ref.watch. Whereas if your code is executing after the UI has built, like maybe if you're inside a click handler, like pressed on a button, or maybe you're on form submit, whatever that is. something that generally reacts to user interaction, or maybe a state change, typically a callback. Then you use read instead. That's generally easy two use cases. It's worth noting that Riverpod comes with a custom lint rules, and there are lint rules in progress to warn you if you used the wrong one. So what at the moment you have to learn about it. Chances are in a few weeks, maybe you wouldn't even have to care about it, because the linter would tell you you used the wrong one and you should use the other one instead.
Okay. We can also look at another question. Should we use like code generation with Riverpod? Because right now the documentation tells about both, right? About code generation and no code generation. What is the difference, and what do you prefer to use?
Yes. So for code generation, again, the documentation covers this. Now you can click on the question mark right next to the code generation toggle. It will open the About Code Generation page. It explains the reasoning why it exists, what it adds to Riverpod. Effectively, Riverpod was kind of always built in with code generation in mind. The thing is, I've refrained from pushing it from the start, mainly because it's always been controversial code generation. But the thing is, there is a language feature called macros, which is basically about code generation built in the language, which is in progress, which hopefully should come in within a few years, I hope. And so I figured to avoid people having to migrate their code once macros are available, because once macros are available, we would obviously use code generation, because at this point there would be no downside to not using to using code generation. Then in that case, Riverpod expose a way to use code generation today using build runner, even though it's slower and some people may dislike it. So basically, you have two choices. Whether if you dislike code generation and you absolutely don't want to use it, it's fine. Just don't use it. That's why all documentations showcase how to do it without code generation and with code generation. So you're free to not use code generation at the moment. Everything is supported so far. At the same time, if you don't mind code generation, I would suggest using it, because it's slightly more future-proof, and you would get sneak peeks at what you could say, improvements. Like, for example, when you use code generation, you have hot reload. By that I mean, if you update the code in a provider, like if I go on a random provider, is there one in this page? Yeah. Say here there is a provider defined with code generation. Say I update this function to return something other than this current string. If we were not using code generation, we would have to do a hot restart to have the new behavior in the application. Whereas if you use code generation, whenever you change the source of a provider, the UI automatically recomputes the provider and shows the new result immediately. At the same time, all the providers which were not modified keep their previous state, so you don't restart the entire application whenever you modify something. So that's one benefit. There are a few other benefits, like maybe DevTools will be better. Some features will be specific to code generation. So there are benefits to using it.
Yes. Okay, I think we can go over some questions, and then after it we can go over the third slide, or I guess like, yeah, I think that makes sense. So let's go to some questions from the community, what they have asked. So let's see if we can make it even bigger. Yeah, okay, there are multiple questions. Maybe we go with this one. How do I handle multiple state in a state notifier, or should I create one state notifier for each state? So there's also like this question that we can talk about. Wait, here, should we use notifier, change notifier, state notifier? What should we use?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I guess that's kind of two different topics, but at the same time, the answer to this question is the same no matter which type of object you use. Pretty much, again, if we look at the code, like if I come back to maybe the first network request page,
Mm-hmm.
when we defined an activity here, it already has a bunch of properties in here. And so it's not like we only store an integer, we store a complex object with multiple different properties. And so you could have a very complex object with a lot of sub-properties, like maybe instead of a string, you could have another complex object with another set of properties. So you, basically, when you use a state provider or maybe the new notifier, which we'll see in a second, you just make a class representing the state you want to have, and you add different properties in here, and yeah, with maybe that's where concatenation is often recommended, because one of the things Riverpod promotes a bit is using immutable state. And when you use immutable state, you want to clone an object. But if you want to clone an object, typically you'll need something called a copy with method. But you have to type it by hand if you're not using code generation, which is a bit tedious. Whereas if you use code generation, you can use something like freezed, for example, or maybe built value, whatever, which already comes with a way to just clone an object. But yeah, but overall, about the question of change notifier versus state notifier versus notifier, the answer is you can use change notifier or state notifier mainly for migrating from existing code bases. Like say you have an existing code base with provider, the provider package, and you're already using change notifier in a bunch of places. I would suggest that if you want to migrate to Riverpod, to first stick to change notifiers on those cases, because you don't want to rewrite your entire application. So just maybe change the provider and use change notifier for those. But for any new logic, I would recommend using the notifier object, which is the syntax we saw here when we define a class. Like if I don't use code generation, we see I define a class extends some notifier. We use this thing pretty much. That's the most up-to-date approach. It's more tailored for Riverpod, whereas state notifier and change notifier are kind of like separate tools. They live on their own, and therefore they are less integrated with Riverpod. Whereas here you get more benefits when you use this one.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. Now we know that we should use notifier when we are using a new project. Then you recommend using notifier. If you are
Uh,
migrating from provider, then you might
it's
still
worth
use it.
noting. It's worth
Mm-hmm.
something that when you use notifier, notifier is not about immutable state versus mutable state. You're free to use the notifier class, but have mutable state too. Um, you can actually, when you do updates, is there, let me check, define listeners, yeah. But like here, when we clone the state here, this line here shows how you typically clone a list, maybe using this spread operator. But you're free to just mutate the list and maybe call notify listeners, like with change notifier. So you can use both approaches.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yes. All right, then maybe let's look at some more questions from the community. Um, yeah, is it a good practice to declare a controller, I mean, scroll controller, text editing controller in a Riverpod class? And I mean, or should we not do it?
I would generally say no. Um, you likely shouldn't do this, mainly because those those objects are typically tied to the widget tree, and you likely often don't want to share them between routes either. Because like this scroll controller, for example, contains the current scroll offset, and so you wouldn't want two different routes to use the same scroll controller. You would likely want that when you press the back button, it reuses the previous scroll controller instead of sharing it between pages, so that the scroll offset is restored. Um, so I would suggest either using plain stateful widgets for those, or again in the documentation you can see the second toggle, which is Flutter hooks, which is an optional package. It's different from Riverpod. It has pretty much nothing to do with it, but it's often combined with it, so that's why documentation talks about it. Basically, it's a different syntax on stateful widgets, which makes creating scroll controllers way simpler. For example, so again, you can check this checkbox if you want, and you'll see what it does, like use animation controller, for example. Although I would say, if you're brand new to Riverpod, I would suggest not using it, mainly because hooks add their own layer of learning curve, and you likely want to just start learning Riverpod first, maybe get familiar with it, and then maybe in the future, if you want to get fancy, you can try it. So that's why if you go to the documentation, it's disabled by default, but you can opt in if you want.
Yes. All right, let's look at some other questions. Is this one good? Does a provider work only if it is being watched in the widget, or can a provider also be watched by another provider?
Yes, providers can watch other providers. Let me check if I have an example for it. I think so, yes, in this page. Again, the combining request page shows various ways you can combine providers. For example, we can reuse this ref.watch method. Like say you define a stream somewhere or a future. You can call ref.watch inside a provider using this ref object passed to providers. And so whenever this object updates, then this provider will re-execute with the new state. Meaning you basically get the most up-to-date state naturally without doing anything. At the same time, Riverpod offers different ways to combine states. Like for example, another approach, which is something we don't have in the provider package, is the listen approach. Basically, you take a provider and you get a callback, which is invoked whenever the state changes. So you can do maybe like show a snack bar, something like that. Again, the read method, which we saw previously. So yeah, providers can watch other providers.
Yes. Okay. All right. Then let's look at some other questions. I think here maybe one about disposing. Can I dispose a river pod on logout, then wake it on login without using auto dispose? Because in the same session we don't need to dispose.
If my understanding of the question is correct, I would say because if it's about maybe you want to clear some state when the user logs out, chances are you have a provider for the current user informations, like maybe a user provider or something like that. And then you have other providers which you want to clear when the user logs out. And so the typical way of doing this would be in the provider you want to clear, like the other state, like maybe the friends of the current user. You have a friend list provider, something like that. In that friend list provider, you would call ref.watch on the user provider such that whenever the user changes, the friend list updates too. So if the user logs out, then obviously that will recompute the friend list, which will update accordingly, maybe show an empty list or something.
Okay. Okay, let's look at some other one. Yeah, this is also like interesting for people that still use provider. Is provider going to be obsolete, or will it be maintained and upgraded parallelly with Riverpod?
It's maintained in parallel, mainly because a lot of people are using it. So I see no reason to just delete it. It would just be bothering people for no reason. But at the same time, it's not receiving much updates. So like, don't expect new features to come to provider, likely because it's very difficult to add new features to providers due to technical limitations. At the same time, when there is a need for a new feature, when there is a need for something to be updated on provider, I do it. Like for example, recently, I'm not sure if actually I can talk about it, but maybe you later about it in a few weeks, I guess. But provider is updated when necessary. Yes, I would still recommend using Riverpod. Sorry, I would still recommend using Riverpod overall.
Yes, that's a good choice. Okay, yeah, should we talk about the third slide you mentioned last time in the beginning? We can also talk about this third one. Here's also the autos.
Yes, maybe this one.
Mhm.
Basically, it's about how we can pass parameters to providers in coming from the UI. The main reason I want to talk about this is because it enables significant simplifications of your logic. In part because, in my opinion, this feature is one of the more valuable feature of Riverpod. It's what enables you to maybe do a search as we type or infinite scrolling list very easily, which is something that's missing from the provider package. But at the same time, it's not something you will likely find in a different package because it's very specific to how Riverpod works. So anyway, like so far we've seen how to define a provider, but it's just a normal provider, so there is no argument received. And so if we want to define arguments, we can use some, if we are not using code generation, we can use this dot family here, or if you're using code generation, you can just add whatever parameter you want on your function, be it name parameters, multiple parameters, whatever. Basically add parameters on your function. And then in your function, you can now use them as before. Like for example, in this example, we keep using the board API, but we have a filter that we maybe show in the UI, like for example, maybe a dropdown about which type of activity you want to suggest to people. And so this parameter would be the filter category, the type filter category. So you would then pass it to the network request. And then in your UI, you can no longer just do ref.watch your provider. You now have to pass the parameter you defined previously. So you do ref.watch, the parameter, but now the provider is a function. So you do provider, you invoke the provider with the parameter you defined here. So this value here is the one for this variable here. And so if you define two variables in here, you would have to pass two variables in here. If you made this a named parameter, for example, then you would use the name of the name parameter in here. And then this will execute this function with just this specific combination of parameters. And an important point is that your parameters passed here must override equal. So like, for example, a string is fine because it overrides equal equal, but don't just go and create a random list in here. Like, don't type, well, I'm not sure if I can type in here. Don't go and type provider list like this. This won't work because lists don't override equal equal, so you would get a new state every time you try to read the provider, which is not desired. Again, if you enable lint roles, you would see a warning for this. But anyway, one interesting note is when you pass parameters to providers, I'm not sure I actually have an example for this, but because it's interesting with passing parameters to providers is it's basically a declarative approach about listening to state. So for example, this parameter could be the current index of a paginated API. And so for example, you could go in here and change this activity type to maybe an integer, which is the page offset, which you want to do for your paginated API. And then when you use your list view, you get in the list view.builder, you get the current index. And so you could pass that index to the provider. And so when the user scrolls, the index will keep incrementing, and the provider will keep receiving the new index. And so you would naturally, without doing anything special besides just passing a parameter in here, have an infinite scrolling list, because as you scroll down, your UI will naturally fetch more data as you need. Although an example is missing for this one, but I believe you can look at the official example. This one, it's a on different link, so you won't see here. But click on maybe Marvel or the laptop dev client too. They both use this pattern to use their infinite list, so you can look at how they do it. It's just a parameter on a provider.
Mm-hmm. All right. You added also recently something new to the documentation, or do you want to talk about this one as well, or do you think it's not so important?
What do you mean by this? Because technically everything we've seen so far is new pages.
Okay. Okay, all right. Then let's go on. I mean, there are maybe some last questions we can take before ending this live stream. You can even still write, maybe pick still your question. So let's look at it. Yeah, I think we also might want to know the opinion about many people ask like what should we like use Block or Riverpod, and I think there were some people also mentioning GetX. So what is your opinion about the other state managements compared to Riverpod?
I mean, obviously I'm biased. You can't expect me to say use Block. Of course I will say use Riverpod.
Yes.
For me, Riverpod kind of solves a problem which I don't see other packages attempting to solve. There are actually a few attempts, sorry, but they're way less popular. So a few with maybe like 10 stars on GitHub. And using they still have some downsides in my opinion, like maybe they're using untyped APIs. But basically, one of the cool thing with the way Riverpod promotes logic in your application, it makes it declarative. It basically makes you write code for your business logic like you would do with writing UI in your widgets. You make your build method, and your build method updates automatically whenever something changes. You don't have to maybe react to a mutation, and when there is a mutation update, you have to clone the state yourself. Generally, you can just use ref.watch from provider, and most of the logic will be done for you. Of course, that might be a bit abstract for you at the moment, which is why I would likely suggest trying it out a bit and see the differences. But yeah.
Okay. All right, let's see if there are like some last question that we take, and then I think we will end the live stream. Okay, Riverpod versus Block, some new question again. But okay, that's exactly the same what we right now said. You are, of course, saying
Yeah, I mean,
Riverpod is,
I'm not going to talk bad about the other packages. Like
yes.
even Netflix, I know some people dislike it. At that point, I'm like, it's fine. Some people like using it. I personally don't like it, but that's all right. If you like it, just go ahead and use it.
Yes. Is there, I don't know if this question is even a good one. What is the best architecture for Riverpod for mid-sized apps, such an e-commerce shopping app? Um, is there any like, I mean, we have talked right now how to use Riverpod, but is there any best architecture that you have, maybe an example app that they can look at? And
Yeah, there are a few example apps in the official examples category. Maybe you can maybe even look at the third-party examples, which is basically examples from contributors. I don't necessarily know if they follow good practices because I don't necessarily look at every single example. But if you want to see how I do something, you look at the official examples. If you want to see what people use Riverpod for, you can look at the third-party examples. You'll see a lot of possibilities here. But yeah, generally, Riverpod is a bit, what's the word? When you use it, it tends to promote specific architecture. You often will get as a warning if you try to do something. You'll find something that's overly complicated if you try to go on the. If you try to do something that's not recommended by Riverpod, it might be more difficult because it tries to push you towards the good practices. So you shouldn't necessarily have to think too much about architecture. Just keep using Riverpod like it feels great to use, and in theory you should be fine.
okay, all right. Do you want to mention anything last about Riverpod that the people need to know about Riverpod, or anything else that you might think is interesting for them to know if they want to start with Riverpod or if they want to advance with Riverpod?
Yes, I definitely have big plans for Riverpod. Like I see someone mentioning in the chat whether I'm happy with the current state of Riverpod. Yeah, I regularly come back to the Riverpod API and like the new design decisions. Like whenever I look back at the API of the provider package, I'm always like, no, that should be different. That should be like this and like that. But with Riverpod, I don't see anything major that would rewrite. I feel like it's in a good state. And what I want to work on now is more about streamlining the experience, like maybe adding dev tools for Riverpod, adding maybe some more features, like maybe offline persistence, to simplify the state management more, more link rules to catch potential mistakes, stuff like those. Overall, I don't think I will rewrite Riverpod in a significant way.
Okay, I see. From the questions that the people ask here, do you think any question you still want to answer? What is like? I mean, here have some people still written something. I don't find a simple way directly to update family modifiers providers, or what is the best way to learn listen for a stream?
For stream, it's straightforward. There is also a documentation about this again. Like if you look at the WebSockets and synchronous execution, it basically shows how you're not forced to use features. It's fine if you just return a plain integer, or you can also return a stream. Sorry, where is it? Listening to a stream. Like for example, in a provider, you're free to return stream, and then in your UI, you'll naturally listen to that stream. You can handle loading and errors again, so you can just return stream and your UI would work.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. Okay, all right. I think now we have basically talked in detail about Riverpod, and it's like 1 hour right now, so we can probably end it. But I really thank you, Remi, for being here in this live stream and for giving us so much news about Riverpod and how to use it and talking about the new documentation. And yeah, thank you very much for being here.